Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Please may we call Mr. Pardoe?
Yeah.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly, declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Could you confirm your full name, please, Mr. Pardoe?
David John Pardoe.
You should have in front of you, in a bundle, a hard copy of a witness statement in your name, dated the 24th of October 2023. Have you got that?
Indeed.
If you can turn to page 55 of that document, please.
Yes.
You should have a copy with a visible signature. Is that right?
It is indeed.
Is it your signature?
It is.
Are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
For the purposes of the transcript, the reference for the statement is WITN 081-70100. Thank you for coming to the inquiry to assist it in its work and for providing the witness statement that you have. As you know, I will be asking questions on behalf of the inquiry. Starting, please, with an overview of your career with the Post Office. I understand that you have not had the benefit of seeing any written records confirming the exact dates for which you held relevant roles. Is that right?
Unfortunately, that's correct.
And the account of the roles you held set out in your statement is you doing your best from memory?
Indeed.
Is it right that you first joined the Post Office as a Crown Office counter clerk?
Yes.
Can you help with what year that was? You've said how old you were in the statement. Can you help with which year that was, roughly?
It had been sometime in the 80s.
You then progressed to hold a number of administrative roles within the Liverpool district. One of these roles was designing and delivering training for sub-postmasters. Is that right?
It was.
And what did that training cover?
So that was a significant shift, I think I say in the statement, that historically a new sub-postmaster had effectively sat with the outgoing sub-postmaster and been trained on site. And the ramification of that on occasion is that some bad habits were being picked up right from the get-go. So it was decided that there would be bespoke, classroom-driven training by skilled trainers who would then take the new sub-postmaster through a standard suite of training requirements, and they would then supplement that by on-site training. So I think from memory there'd be a week or so spent in a training facility, and then there would be at least 1 week spent working each day at branch with the sub-postmaster. And I was one of 2 trainers who were actually trialling that approach nationally on behalf of the Post Office.
There came a point when you were approached by the Post Office Investigation Department to take up a specific role. Before you explain what that role was, can you help with the remit of the Post Office Investigation Department at that time?
So the Post Office Investigation Department, we'd refer to them as POID at the time, and they had a group-wide remit. So they would conduct investigations impacting Royal Mail Group, and from memory at the time that would have consisted of Post Office, of Royal Mail, of Cashco, who were the cash-carrying arm of the Post Office, and Parcel Force Worldwide as well, who were obviously the parcel-carrying arm of the Post Office, and they would conduct the full range of investigation activities on behalf of those business units.
What was the role you were offered when you were first approached by the POID?
Yeah, I was approached by 2 gentlemen that I already knew were members of POID. I think ironically one had interviewed me for a counter shortage a year or so before that, and they approached me. And they outlined that there was a branch in inner city Liverpool, that it was a sub-office branch, or a modified branch, I think it was referred to at the time, run by a sub-postmaster, that was having a series of significant losses and suspected benefit book payment fraud. They knew the postmaster was not involved, and they asked if effectively, and it sounds a little bit grandiose, if effectively I'd go undercover in that branch, run that branch on behalf of the sub-postmaster, whilst at the same time being the conduit for them to perform covert surveillance. And this was the day when covert surveillance couldn't be done remotely, couldn't be done by IP cameras. It was simply a pinhole camera in a false ceiling connected to a video recorder. And my remit was to run the branch on a day-to-day basis and to change the videotapes and to meet one or other of the two gentlemen early morning in branch to hand over videotape product from the previous 2 or 3 days.
You were then offered the role of the investigation liaison officer, is that right?
That's correct.
And that was in around 1991?
It would have been, yes.
What did the role involve?
So I've referenced POID as being obviously the group-wide body that would drive investigations. So for each business unit, there needed to be some form of conduit to take suspected cases of dishonesty and report those cases into POID. And that liaison role, that's exactly what that did. So it would take prima facie cases concerning potential staff dishonesty, it would put those into a reporting format, submit with that outline of evidence and submit that for consideration for further investigation into POID. So it would not have been performing first officer, certainly, would not even have been performing second officer type activity. It was purely an administrative role that would be the conduit between the Liverpool district, as I remember at the time, and national POID, or certainly the Liverpool branch of POID.
Is it right that there was no formal training for the POID interface role?
None whatsoever. And if I'm go on, I feel I say in the statement that I didn't feel disadvantaged by that. It was purely, I'd have a report from an audit function, from a regional manager, an area manager, and I would report that into POID. It was as simple as that. It was more administrative.
Is it right that there came a point when you were encouraged to become more involved in investigations being submitted to the POID?
And this is where I'm really going to have to search back into my memory. There came a time when I had elements of formal training with a view that rather than just simply piecemeal hand this investigation product over to POID, that we would start to support as second officers. I never fully understood the politics behind that. I suspect that sat some way above my pay grade. But you're right, there was certainly a time when we were being encouraged to sit closer with POID, and that would involve performing second officer type activity at interviews under caution.
You say at paragraph 11 of your statement that this was the start of your formal training. Can you recall even roughly what year this would have been?
I think we'd be coming towards the mid-1990s, I would have thought, for that. Potentially coming into the late 1990s, that would seem to ring a bell with me.
And is it right that this training was classroom-based training delivered by Royal Mail Group?
It was indeed, I do recall that, yes.
And you say at paragraph 11 of your statement that you had access to other materials, is that right?
Yes.
And you also say at paragraph 11 that you were very heavily mentored by an experienced and far more senior investigation manager in this role.
Absolutely, yes.
You then became an assistant investigator in the newly formed Regional Security Department, is that right?
Correct.
Again, roughly speaking, how many years after taking on the second officer role did you become an assistant investigator?
It would have been a matter of years. It certainly wasn't a short few months. It would have been a matter of years.
And at this stage, you underwent further training, is that right?
Absolutely.
And you say that included classroom training as well as electronic and paper handouts.
From memory, yes.
You also have a recollection of meeting members of the criminal law team in your training, is that right?
Yes, in Croydon, Impact Health, as they were based at the time, yes.
You say at paragraph 21(2) of your statement that you recall training sessions from both in and out of house lawyers, as well as training staff from the Post Office Investigation Department. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Can you recall roughly how long you were an assistant investigator before you became a substantive lead investigator?
It would have been 2-3 years, something like that.
You deal with becoming a lead investigator at paragraph 16 of your statement. Could we have that on screen, please? It is page 6 of WITN 081-70100. You say here, again, I would need reference to Post Office HR details, but I then became a substantive lead investigator. This move was supported by additional training and my lead work, first officer interviews, file preparation, and so on, was highly supervised to the extent that even grammatical errors within reports would be returned for correction. That was the standard of supervision. Even after this promotion to lead investigator, I remained in supervision for many, many months, and certainly longer than for any professional role I have held subsequently. I don't think this was any reflection on my ability to progress at pace, it was just the way it was. There was a recognition that the role was unique and required a high level of interpersonal skill and confidence to deploy effectively. You deal further with this role at paragraph 21(3) of your statement. Could we turn to that, please? It's page 9. And scrolling down, please, to little Roman numeral 3. You say, the investigator role was regionally based. My training detailed above was supplemented by significant levels of supervision and general oversight. In this role, I was performing the role of lead investigator and discharging activity from interviews under caution through to case paper and committal preparation. To the best of my knowledge, all my tenure in this capacity was pre-Horizon. Is it right then that you stopped conducting investigations yourself before the introduction of the Horizon system in the year 2000?
Yes, it is. I certainly recall that, to the extent, if I may add, that I think I was deployed doing other activity when formal Horizon training was being undertaken, and I had to have effectively a supplementary oversight course to that.
From the position of being a regional lead investigator, is it right that you then became an investigation team leader, also regionally?
I do wonder if that wasn't superseded by another role, albeit there was a period, obviously, when I became an investigation team leader.
Can you recall what that other role might have been in the interim?
I know that there was a role where I was seconded, I think it was for around about 12 months, on the creation of Post Office Limited. So that was project management work, working from London. As I say, I don't know if that came before or after. I apologise, I don't know if that became before or after the team leader role. I certainly, yes, became a substantive investigation team leader.
You deal with the team leader role and the national roles you held at paragraph 21(4) of your statement. Scrolling down a little, please. You say, I don't recall me holding national investigator role. I thought this was a title afforded to a former line manager, Mr. Tony Utting. There was a period when I was responsible for leading a small team of investigators, again a regional role. This role was leading on complex investigations and supporting a team to ensure effective casework delivery. Again, this was mainly pre-Horizon and was interspaced with a period supporting Tony Utting as National Investigation Manager for Post Office Limited. I also supported Mr. Utting at this time with the draft of policy documents and also was seconded for a 12-month period as a project head to the creation of Post Office Limited from Post Office Counters.
Correct.
In terms of the role you held supporting Tony Utting with the draft of policy documents, there is a document which has been provided to you relatively recently, which may assist with dating this role. Could we have that on screen, please? The reference is POL 001 66569. This document is undated, but it appears to set out the roles and responsibilities of a role you held at one point, that of Internal Crime Policy and Standards Manager. Do you recognise this document now?
I do, yes.
Did you hold this role, Internal Crime Policy and Standards Manager?
I did. I wonder how much of the substantive role actually undertook those deliverables, but I certainly held a role with that title, yes.
Looking, please, to the last section towards the bottom of the page, role of assurance, to the last bullet point. This is to provide assurance to the National Internal Crime Manager in own areas of accountability. Is this the role you were referring to in your statement when you say you supported Tony Utting as a National Investigation Manager?
It is. I've clearly used the wrong title. Apologies, yes.
And so do you think it is this role that involves you supporting Mr. Utting with the draft of policy documents?
As required, yes.
At the top of this document, please, the scope of area is set out. And the first thing listed is MI, access flows adequacy. Can you help with what MI is an acronym for?
Management information.
And then the second bullet point there, legal services, criminal law conduit, and internal crime risks and issues. Under the role of user for own operations teams, that first heading, there's this: ensure that MI flows and sources are identified that facilitate the identification and prosecution of internal crime. Second bullet point, establish the adequacy of MI flows in the support of the above. And thirdly, ensure that MI access is identified to enable data retrieval in line with demands above. Pausing there, can you help with what data was to be retrieved?
Sorry, I simply reading that, I don't recall that. I think that's an element of the role that was clearly there within the design of the role that just didn't come through to fruition. I don't recall at that stage having a substantive role where I'd be the conduit for MI access at all, sorry.
The next bullet point says this: through legal services, criminal law team, establish the legal status of the branch trading statement. Is this a reference to the introduction of branch trading?
I'm assuming it is, but again, I have no recollection that I deployed any elements of that.
So this would have been after the introduction of Horizon?
Yes.
Trying to date this document?
Yes.
The inquiry understands branch trading to have been introduced in around 2005. Does that fit with your recollection of things?
I'd have to go with that. I thought this would be slightly earlier, but if that's the case, that's the case.
it appears that one of your responsibilities was to establish the legal status of the branch trading statement. Can you recall why there was a need to establish the legal status of the branch trading statement?
And again, that is an element of the role that I do not think came through to fruition. I do not recall a piece of work. In fact, I don't know why that would even sit with that type of policy and standards role.
Were you given any kind of briefing for this role?
Well, of course, there would have been a job description. There would have been a remit to that role. But after the passage of so much time, I can't say with conviction the precise elements of the role and its deliverables.
In the context of branch trading statements, were events at Marine Drive Post Office relating to a sub-postmaster called Lee Castleton raised with you by anyone, either in a briefing when you took up the role or at any other point before or after you took up this role?
From memory, no.
To the extent that you can recall, was the focus on the branch trading statement as a result of a desire to ensure that the branch trading statement had the status of an unimpeachable record of the stock and cash which an auditor should find when they audited a branch?
I don't recall it ever being outlined to me in that context, unfortunately, no.
Can you recall what the criminal law team's role was in relation to establishing the legal status of the branch trading statement?
No, I can't.
Looking at the next bullet point, please. Through legal services, criminal law team, research alternative criminal charges to accompany change in status of cash account to trading statement. Why was there a need to research alternative criminal charges to accompany the change in status of cash account to trading statement?
I've absolutely no clue. I've not a clue. Again, I wouldn't know why that would sit with a policy and standards role. It seems completely outside of that. You know, that should sit firmly with the criminal law team.
Can you recall there being any discussion of alternative criminal charges?
No, I can't.
The next bullet point says this: comment on training and communication needs to operational investigators and other identified stakeholders. Was this referring to training and communication required because of the introduction of branch trading, or more generally?
More generally, from recollection.
Did you provide any comment on what the training and communication needs for operational investigators were?
I would assume that I did during that period, yes.
And the last bullet point here, identify and comment on internal crime risk issues within scope. Can you recall if there were any new crime risk issues which you identified on taking up this role?
The only thing that springs to mind is if this was towards the cessation of the benefit book as a method of payment, which from memory would have been around about 2005, then there would have been quite a significant tranche of work to risk assure the withdrawal of that post office product.
Going to the next section, please, the role of planning. It says here, you were to feed into the planning team information on issues, risks, concerns, training and comms requirements for operational investigators and other stakeholders. And then the last section deals with assurance. We've touched on that last bullet point already. Could we have paragraph 33 of Mr. Pardoe's statement on screen, please? It is page 15 of WITN. You say at paragraph 33, very early in my security career, I worked with Tony Utting as National Investigation Manager. I held for a very brief period a policy and standards role. I do not recognise any of my work from this period in the supplied documents. This would certainly have been a pre-Horizon role. Any of my work from that time, I suspect, would predate materials available to be given to the inquiry. Having seen the roles and responsibilities document since making your statement, I think you now accept that the policy and standards role was in fact a role you held after the rollout of the Horizon system.
Absolutely, yes.
Although you could not recognise any of your policy drafting work in the documents supplied to you by the inquiry, can you recall what type of policy documents you worked on?
I think logically there'd have been documents around case file construction, documents of that nature. I can't be more specific, unfortunately.
Accepting that it is difficult to recall exact dates now, can you recall whether you took up the role of Senior Security Manager before or after you held the Policy and Standards role?
I think that would have been a more senior role, so logically that would have been after the Policy and Standards role.
So assuming that you held the role, the Policy and Standards role, at the point when branch trading was introduced in around 2005, would that mean you took up the role of Senior Security Manager?
It would.
After that?
It would.
You address at paragraph 22 of your statement the varied positions you held when you were a Senior Security Manager, which included Commercial Security Manager, and Fraud Strand or Security Operations Manager. The title, it seems, varying depending on the terminology used to describe this strand of the security team. Is that right?
Correct.
Is it right that it was in this role, as a Senior Security Manager leading the Fraud or Security Operations strand of the security team, that you made decisions on prosecutions as the nominated representative?
I believe so, yes.
A position that we've also heard referred to as the designated prosecuting authority.
Correct.
You say that your training continued when you held these roles, and you qualified as a Proceeds of Crime Act Senior Appropriate Officer. Is that right?
It is.
At paragraph 20 of your statement, you suggest that Ian Murphy was the fraud strand leader for a period throughout 2010, and you think he was your successor. Is that right?
I do. And from recollection, this is where the waters become muddied. So there would have been Ian Murphy. I then think that the role handed over to potentially Andy Haywood, and then onwards from that, it's certainly that 10, 11 going into 12, where I probably lack some clarity around succession.
Is it right, therefore, that you think you moved to the crime intelligence and administrative function titled Grapevine in 2010?
I think it may have been later than that. If I may, the piece that throws me is that there is clearly within the papers a prosecution decision made by myself. There is then a prosecution report addressed to Ian Murphy, but then the decision precedes Ian Murphy. So I'm confused there about the exact time that Ian would have been in post and why it appears I've ebbed and flowed out of that post.
If we can have paragraph 20 on screen, please. It's page 8. Scrolling down a bit, please. About halfway down this paragraph. You refer to Mr. Murphy here, and you say in relation to the senior security manager in leading the fraud strand, you think Mr. Murphy held the position throughout 2010. So what do you think you were doing in 2010?
That's the bit I'm really struggling to recollect.
You say in this paragraph that you think you returned to to security operations for a period in 2011, is that right?
Correct.
But you say you had certainly taken up the substantive Grapevine senior security manager role by 2012.
Correct.
We'll come on to the detail of that role in due course. Finally, for around 9 months before you left the post office in late 2014, you say you were removed from your role, and you deal with this at paragraph 22.5 of your statement. It's page 12, please. You say, around 9 months or so before I left in late 2014, I was effectively being removed from my role and asked to design a structure that would again support a reduction in headcount, as well as accommodate my departure. I wasn't exactly placed on gardening leave, but my operational career with Post Office was at an end, and I was more or less omitted from all other activity. Restructuring and repeated reductions in headcount feature in a number of places in your statement. Could we go back, please, to page 6 of the statement, to paragraph 17? Here you say this: there followed a further series of team restructures, building moves and boundary moves. The function throughout the years, if not decades, always struck me as an easy target to drive headcount reduction. Indeed, later in my career, I was performing the role of consultation manager for a long-serving colleague who had been subject to redundancy. I was to follow a party line around change being a business necessity, when the colleague abruptly stopped me and proceeded to produce a piece of paper and recount the 14 restructures they had been personally impacted by since joining the post office, the majority in the security field. That was the regularity of structure change. You address this theme further at paragraph 30 of your statement. Could we go to that, please? It's page 14. You say here, function changes could be significant. I seem to recall organisational charts with 80 or so colleagues, quickly depleted over the years. There were several significant changes that led to sizable redundancies, strand renaming, and functional job titles changing. Do you think that the depletion of numbers within the security team had a detrimental impact on the adequacy and sufficiency of investigations?
Without a shadow of a doubt.
One example you give in your statement of resourcing changes impacting upon the scope of investigation work is at paragraph 43. Could we have that on screen, please? It's page 18. You say there was also a period when resources would have been applied to suspected thefts from SPMR assistants. By this, I mean cash thefts and not simply fraud against customers and or clients. This ceased when I was new in role and ended with the transition of districts to regions that I mentioned earlier in the statement. On an aside, I do think that that was a retrograde step, as it left SPMRs isolated and with the unenviable task of attempting to engender police support to counter and evidence suspected employee theft. This retrograde step had a direct impact on sub-postmasters who experienced an apparent loss in branch and suspected their staff of theft, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Was it a step taken to save money?
Yes, it was.
To your knowledge, where there was a shortfall in a sub-postmaster's branch and the evidence pointed to theft on the part of a member of a sub-postmaster's staff, was it the post office's approach to seek to recover the shortfall under the sub-postmaster's contract?
On every occasion.
Before the resourcing change you address at paragraph 43, would the post office have prosecuted the staff member and sought to recover the money from them directly through the criminal courts?
From memory, yes. So the logical steps that would be taken would be an out-of-hours on-site meeting with the sub-postmaster, a review of the trading accounts, at which that stage would be paper-based daily and weekly trading accounts. And then logically, there would ordinarily be a covert camera would be installed at branch. When we refer to the stage when I was the liaison officer, that would be another element of my role. I would view the ensuing video product as and when theft was identified, and I must add in the majority of cases theft was identified, then that product would be passed into the Post Office Investigation Department for their direct investigation.
Was a material factor in the resourcing change a view within the post office that it was easier to recover money from a sub-postmaster under their contract than to go after the thief directly?
I think element, yes, but I think the primary driver, which has already been touched on, is that is undoubtedly a resource-hungry approach, and a decision was taken some way above my pay grade that that was no longer a suitable application of investigation resource.
Were you or your colleagues ever consulted about business restructures or reductions in headcount?
So if I can just break that down. In terms of consultation, we would be very much handed the fait accompli. So I tended to take a lead on the majority of the restructures once I reached a suitable grade. You would be told that there would be a number of hours and an associated financial cost that had to be lost from the function, and I would go away and work with other strand leads and with the head of security about repopulating a function that would achieve those cost reduction demands.
Did you ever raise concerns about the impact of restructuring or headcount reductions with your seniors?
Absolutely.
Can you elaborate on that?
There was a step taken on every occasion that it was better to put your hand up and volunteer to lose resource rather than wait for the business to come after you and demand that that resource be reduced. So we would always be on the front foot of almost offering up resource. And to my mind, there was no correlation between the resource we were offering up and the demands on the function in terms of the numbers of cases that were being raised and the demands on individual investigators. And I think both myself and other senior security personnel had some real concerns about the functions that were being lost and the increased demands that were being placed on investigators, particularly as a result. Obviously, there were other functions of the security family that were being impacted, but certainly on the operational investigators, because it followed no logic. You know, this was not a function that was experiencing less caseload. There were some significant changes going on for sub-postmasters during this time. UK PLC were changing in the way that they were customers of the post office. So that gone were the days when customers would queue up every quarter to pay a phone bill or a gas bill, or queue up every 6 months to pay a car tax. The result of that is that, in my opinion, and fact, is that sub-postmaster salaries were reducing year on year. That increased the financial demand. Logically, that could increase the demand on an investigation function because of wrongdoing. So there's a complete anathema there that then would lead to a function that's reducing in size, because obviously activity would have to cease.
What was the response of those you raised concerns with?
We marched on regardless, and we lost the heads accordingly.
I'm sorry, can you say that last bit again?
We marched on regardless, and we lost the heads accordingly.
What was it that led to you being removed from your role 9 months before your departure?
I say removal, so this is not a physical removal. This was just, you just sense and you know that you are being omitted from future plans, from future strategic development. So I'd still be within the workplace, but it's just a sense, isn't it? You just know that, I guess, you know, my light was about to extinguish, and that I was, by that stage, I'd had a leaving date from the business, and that I knew that I would be leaving that business imminently.
Did you get any impression of why it was that this plan for you had been formed?
I think it was a common practice, to be honest. I'd seen it before with other peers, that once, if you want, they were out of favour, that there would be almost a discarding of them. They were no longer seen to be useful, and that it was just a matter of time until they exited the business and the function just continued.
Do you know why you were out of favour?
I think we used an expression, don't we, about falling out of love. I was incredibly proud of my post office career. I was proud of the things that I'd achieved, the way that I'd developed personally and professionally. I became tired with the prevailing culture. I became more conscious of the impact that the culture was having on both my peers' direct reports and direct reports to direct reports. I became more sensitive as an individual in the decisions that we were quite coldly making were having significant personal impacts on individuals. And I think it's probably fair to say it's a culture that I wanted to step away from. With hindsight, and hindsight's always 20/20, it's probably a decision that I should have taken some years previously.
You also say at paragraph 20 of your statement that you have an issue with several prosecution decision-making activities and subsequent inputs, which you address later in your statement. We'll come on to those parts of your statement in more detail in due course. But broadly speaking, do these relate in the main to the messaging of the post office around the reliability of the Horizon system?
No.
No. What do the concerns, or did the concerns, with the prosecution decision-making activities and subsequent inputs relate to?
I think you say, sorry if there's any confusion, I think it refers to the continuity of my involvement once the decision had been made.
Can you explain that a little more?
Absolutely. So, yes, I could have been in that post. Again, we come to that 2010-11 when a decision's been made, again, without a definitive suite of organisational charts. I don't know when I would have left that role. So a decision could be made. There then could, say, be a request for further evidence, or there could be a twist and turn in that decision-making process. I may not have been in post then to actually see that through to fruition.
You refer at paragraph 19 of your statement to having worked with some individuals at the post office who were highly capable and committed to doing their role to the best of their ability, and others who were less so and who would be managed accordingly. Can you recall any examples of an individual being less capable and committed to their role? If I can ask you to pause there.
Attention please. This is the test of the fire and voice alarm system. There is no need to take any action. Attention please. This is the test of the fire and voice alarm system. There is no need to take any action.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? Fire has been reported in the building. This report is being investigated. Please listen for further instructions. May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? Fire has been reported in the building.
Attention please. The test of the fire and voice alarm system has now been completed. Attention please. The test of the fire and voice alarm system has now been completed.
Our apologies for that interruption. My question before the alarm was, can you recall any examples of an individual being less capable and committed to their role with the effect that they were managed?
Absolutely, yes.
Would you share those with us?
Absolutely.
Or an
So,
example with us?
We used to use an expression which I guess is somewhat distasteful, but we'd irrespective of the support that we'd give an individual. So this was always, if you look at the investigator, this was always a role that it was accepted there would be a significant lead in time to perform competently. But there would be an expression that would be used if an individual was tackle shy. And what that would translate to is that an individual could not quite get over that hurdle of making the introductions to a suspect, sitting them down, performing a competent interview. If that whole part of the process just filled them with so much turmoil because of what they were facing that they just couldn't perform the role effectively. I know of at least 2, if not 3 individuals where probably even after the probationary period we had to draw a line in the sand, almost with one of them for their own benefit to say, this clearly is not working. You're full, the anxiety that you're exhibiting, even with the thought of sitting somebody down interviewing them is so much that, the view's taken that the role is not going to be for you. And that happened on at least 2 occasions, if not 3.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 13 of Mr. Pardoe's statement? This is page 4. So this is going back to the period in time in relation to your training that you received when you were an assistant investigator, so the bottom of paragraph 12 before there. And at paragraph 13, you say this about your training. This period saw me receive significantly more training, both formally and informally. It is difficult to recall the timeline, but at various stages in an operational role, I received classroom investigative training, internally and externally delivered courses around search awareness, using Metropolitan Police facilities, interviewing course with Lancashire Constabulary, PACE training, RIPA awareness and CPIA awareness, elements such as PACE, RIPA, HRA and CPIA were supplemented with various materials that were intended for retention. PACE and CPIA codes of practice would have been available within every interview kit. I still recall having the codes in my investigation kit. In my post office career, I also studied and passed my Proceeds of Crime Act Senior Appropriate Officer. This was a pass-fail one-week course delivered by the National Police Improvement Agency. The training you received here, you describe here, with the exception of your POCA training, was this all training you received as an investigator pre-Horizon?
From memory, yes, and logically it would have been.
So at the time you were an investigator, you recall there being copies of the PACE and CPIA codes of practice available in an interview kit, is that right?
So CPIA, need to refresh my memory, is that 97, is it?
At 96.
96, then yes, there would have been.
What was an interview kit?
So an interview kit would be a ring binder similar to the one I've got in front of me. You would have witness statements in there, you'd have bank authority disclosures, blanks in there, you'd have the introduction to tape recorded interviews, logically you'd have the most up-to-date copy of PACE, you'd have the CPIA codes of practice, you may carry with you the police almanac as well in there, so it would be a variety of blank templates that could be useful for any particular investigating activity, along with the codes of practice and police almanac.
And how was this kit used? Where did you take it?
Everywhere with you. So if you're going out doing an operational investigation that could have resulted in an interview under caution, we would use a 2-tape Neil tape recorder, and as well as the tape recorder with you, you would carry, I think the vernacular was the tackle kit, you would carry this kit with you. So traditionally it would have been kept in the boot of investigators' cars, ready to be used on various operational activities.
When you were a senior security manager, were investigators still provided with copies of the PACE and CPIA codes of practice in an interview kit?
Absolutely. So if there had been any change to that, that would have been given to existing investigators, and then new hires to the function traditionally would have been given that through their formal training.
You refer at paragraph 35 of your statement to a suite of policies and procedural standards, listing the legislation and codes you refer to at paragraph 13 here. Where was this suite of policies and procedural standards held, and how would investigators access this material? So both when you were an investigator and later when you were a senior security manager.
I think from memory it was electronic.
Was there an electronic repository for training materials which investigators could access in the same way as that suite of policy documents could be?
I seem to recall that there was.
You don't mention the Attorney General's guidelines on disclosure at paragraph 13 of your statement, which may be explained because you're referring there to training pre-Horizon, so pre-2000. But when you were in the roles you held after you stopped conducting investigations yourself, were you aware of the Attorney General's guidelines on disclosure?
I was aware of them, yes, but I'm struggling to recall what format they would have been available to the investigators.
Do you think they were available to investigators or not?
I couldn't answer that with absolute accuracy, unfortunately.
Both when you were an investigator and when you were a senior security manager, was there any method for updating investigators about changes in the law or applicable codes or guidance?
Yes, there was. So At earlier stages, when we were still part of the group, I seem to recall that would have been a group function. And then at later stages, I seem to recall that would have come through the criminal law team.
You deal in a little more detail with the training you had in interviews and search at paragraph 62 of your statement. And you make clear there that the courses you attended personally and reference in your statement may well have subsequently been made obsolete or replaced by other training interventions. In particular, your training on investigative interviewing was done under Lancashire Constabulary, and your search course was led by the group trainers at the Met Police Training College using their search houses. Is that right?
It is right, yes.
Do you know whether that external provided training continued after the year 2000, so when you were in other roles?
I'm fairly sure that the relationship with Lancs Constab didn't continue. That was particularly looking at a piece model for investigative interviews. I'm fairly sure that didn't continue. The search awareness piece using Met Police facilities, I'm not sure about that one. I think there may have been, it was a key area for investigators. I think there may have been a replacement to that one. I'm unsure whether that continued to use Met facilities.
You undertook some further academic learning yourself, didn't you, culminating in the completion of an MSc in Security and Risk Management?
That's correct.
And is it right that that was completed with the submission in September 2000 of an academic study on the reasons why sub-postmasters committed offences, including theft?
Correct.
Was the study based on your experiences as an investigator with the Post Office?
So it was partially that, and it was also through legitimised access to historic investigation reports and précis of interviews. What
were the key themes covered in your study?
So the study looked at verbalisation and rationalisation, and it proposed that there were three main types of offenders that the Post Office were dealing with during that period. Would you like me to go through those, or?
If you'd like to.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So number one, I think are detailed within the dissertation, were highly acquisitive. So these would include sub-postmasters who had direct links with organised crime groups or were being influenced by organised crime groups. I go into some details around that. I particularly recall dealing with a sub-postmaster who'd stolen money to buy a Ferrari. I dealt with a sub-postmaster who had stolen money to travel the world watching Formula One. Sub-postmaster who had stolen money, travelled Europe with a Michelin guide to fine dining. So they were, at the top tranche, highly, highly acquisitive. I dealt with a sub-office assistant who was on the equivalent of minimum wage, who was renting a Georgian manor house with swimming pool. I still remember that with some clarity. I remember disclosing that pre-interview to his legal representative, and his legal rep actually put his head in his hands because I disclosed the estate agent's details to where his client was renting. So that's very much at the top tier. The second category, I've already touched on these, and these were absolute victims of us as customers of the Post Office changing. My father was a sub-postmaster. It's within the statement. He'd been a sub-postmaster since the 1950s. I remember talking to my father before he passed, and that would have been in the 2000s, and he would tell me that in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, he enjoyed financial pay parity at a level that his professional acquaintances, doctors, dentists, lawyers, were also enjoying. That level of remuneration was completely changing. Postmasters were paid a form of commission. More transactions that were conducted, the higher the salary would be. And year on year, salaries were dropping. So that second tranche of individuals that I was actually talking about during the dissertation were purely forced into an offending cycle because they were seeing the post office salary reduce year on year. And the post office, not too subtly, went away from saying to potential sub-postmasters, become a sub-postmaster and have a fantastic standard of living based solely on post office salary. They shifted towards saying rather, become a sub-postmaster because it's a fantastic opportunity to drive additional footfall into what should be your buoyant retail business. They are two completely different propositions. And round about this period leading up to the dissertation, we were dealing with a number of sub-postmasters. I go on to my statement to say that we were dealing with repeat sub-postmasters at the same site on some occasions who were just simply victims of a dwindling post office remuneration without the benefit of a buoyant retail side to prop up the viability of that business. So that was very much the second tranche. At that time, there were being a number of rudimentary audit models were being deployed, really basic models that had something like a return rate of around about 70–80%. I was running one myself in North Wales. There was no machine learning or AI in these models. These were simple models, saying to an earning manager, report back if you go into sub-post office and the retail side is looking depleted of stock. Report if you're going into CTN, confection tobacco news agents with a post office and there's no daily newspapers because the newspaper suppliers put you on stop very quickly if you fail to pay your newspaper bills. And the return rate on that was absolutely staggering. That was an incredibly busy time for the post office. That's at tranche number 2. The tranche number 3 would be individuals who you would interview under caution, who would admit readily their involvement in falsification of, at the time, paper-based accounts, but would deny wholeheartedly being responsible for the thefts. And I always found those the most difficult out of the 3 to deal with. I had very little sympathy or empathy with that top tier. If you're stealing money to buy a Ferrari or a Porsche, you deserve everything that's coming your way. I had sympathy with the second tranche who were victims of a changing UK PLC and changing model of remuneration. But that third bit was incredibly difficult to deal with. Because if I was to believe the account, and on many occasions I did believe the account, it became evident that as you were dealing with that individual, you would go through the mechanics of the tape-recorded interview, and our average interview duration would be around about 45 minutes. And they tended, as ironic as it sounds, to be quite cordial. And if you were sat down after that interview and you'd had refreshments, whatever, you'd outline the next steps around suspension, transfer of office, you would slowly start to see dawn on that individual that their downfall was wholly attributed to either theft by family member, theft by assistant, and you left that family at the end of the day in complete and utter turmoil. And out of everything I dealt with within my post office career, that's the one thing that changed me for as an individual, and probably not for the better, because I'd walk away from a situation and you'd just say, how can anybody willingly, knowingly place an individual in this type of insidious position? And I remember we dealt with, it was quite ironic, we dealt with a whole series of cases where it was the youngest son would just absolutely, for want of a better word, pillage the post office. The older son would want to take all the blame for whatever reason. And it was such a difficult series of investigations to deal with. I think in the statement, from memory, I can't locate a copy of the dissertation, fortunately, but that was certainly a significant element of the 3 tranches. I then break it down, just to come to an end, I break it down into difference between male and female offending as well at the time. We found very little females who were in that top tranche where the thefts purely were for greed. We found more in categories 2 and 3. And that's a brief summary of the dissertation.
The title of your study was There Must Be Some Mistake. Is it fair to say that your study was proceeding on the premise that there was no mistake?
Absolutely, yes. I think it was more, that was actually, somebody actually said that to me. So when we sat down and they were logically asking about next steps, and you would go through, quite legitimately, there would be nothing outside of pace, outside of a captured, recorded interview. You'd go through the logical next steps. So the logic is you'll be suspended from duty, you'll be asked to offer your premises to an interim sub-postmaster. The arrangements between you and them as regards rent is a private matter between you and them, so on and so on. And an individual actually said to me that there's just got to be some mistake.
You say in your statement at paragraph 22.3 that training continued when you were a senior security manager. What training did you receive when you were a senior security manager in addition to the POCA training?
Can I see that paragraph for context, please?
Yes,
Thank you.
it is page 11 of the document on screen.
Thank you.
And subparagraph 3.
Thank you, I've got that one, thank you. Yeah, so save for the POCA senior appropriate officer, I think there was some additional training on evidence in court. I think I probably just tagged along to that one because I had team leaders who were attending and a number of investigators. It's fair to say there would have been less formal operational training at that time, because at that time I'd moved away from day-to-day operational investigation activity.
At paragraph 63 of your statement, you say that all investigators would have received instruction in the use of Horizon. Did you receive instruction or training in the use of Horizon?
I did indeed. I think I referred to earlier. I know for whatever reason I absented the formal training session, but I seem to recall on a one-to-one basis we had a number of counter-training schools across the UK. I'm not sure whether I didn't actually go to Chester to actually have some one-to-one training, just to gain a brief overview. We'd also at that time as well, yes, we would. So during the various bouts of CW industrial action, as senior managers, we would be expected to work at Crown or branch offices. So I'd have undertaken Horizon activities then first-hand, dealing with customers.
You also say at paragraph 63 that you would have envisaged case file construction training for investigators, including obtaining evidence from third parties, but you say you don't recall any specific reference to Horizon data. Just to be clear, are you talking about your recollection of the training you received or the training that was provided to investigators operating under your lead?
Again, could you see that part of the statement, please?
Yes, it's page 25.
Yeah, so that would have been investigators within the function. That would not have been applicable to myself.
Did you ever provide any training to investigators?
Me personally?
Yes.
Not from recollection, no.
Did you attend the training provided to investigators?
Again, from recollection, yes. I think at that time, Post Office had a bespoke training facility just outside Rugby. I certainly seem to recall going there. It may not have been for the full duration, but certainly those training courses which were residential in nature, members of the senior security group would drop into that training at various times within that training week.
Scrolling down a little, please, to paragraph 64. You say here that formal training would have been supplemented with significant levels of supervision in terms of operational activity and case paper construction and submission. This was a role that traditionally had a longer lead-in time given the uniqueness of activity undertaken. We've looked at an earlier paragraph of your statement where you stressed that you had a high level of supervision when you started investigatory roles. Was that the case for investigators operating under your lead throughout the time you were in security operations?
I think probably a lot of my experiences were by virtue of the person who was being mentored at the time. I can't imagine many of the new investigators would see a written report underlined in red and thrown across the room to them. I think it was probably just by virtue of different era, a different type of personality that I was being mentored with at the time, who certainly wouldn't hold back from the niceties of giving you a constructive sandwich in terms of feedback. The casework literally would be physically thrown back at you. You were told to sort out if there was grammatical issues within that paperwork or anything of a similar ilk. But I nevertheless removed the differences in decades to one side. I'd have still expected that new incumbents would have had a decent level of supervision. It was always recognised if you weren't coming into the function from an investigative or policing background, this was not a function that you were expected to be up on your feet in a short few months. It was a completely unique role, and there was some cognizance and allowance given for that fact.
Sir, I've finished one topic, and I wonder if that might be at a convenient moment for the morning break. Just a short 15-minute break, if we may, please.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know what your watch says, sir. The clock here is a little fast on the council's table.
Well, it's actually 10:26 according to me, so 20 to 11.
Yes, sir, thank you. Hello, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you, yeah.
Mr. Pardoe, in terms of policy, when you first started as an investigator, were you given a copy of any document setting out the Post Office prosecution policy?
I suspect I must have been. I don't have that detail of recollection, but logically I must have been given that policy. If I may, I think that was a group policy at the time. So yes, I would have been given that policy.
Did anyone cover what the prosecution policy was in your initial training or set out a rationale for it?
Again, initial training, I don't recall, unfortunately, that level of detail. I'd be surprised if it wasn't touched upon, but I don't recall the specifics, sorry.
Later, when you were a senior security manager, do you recall any discussion of the prosecution policy and the rationale for it? Or you being given any briefing about that?
I think by that stage, I'd have been in the function for some time. It would have just been something that instinctively that you were aware of. If a case had been produced where there was that prima facie evidence of wrongdoing, then it would go up to the criminal law team for their advice as regards the realistic prospects of conviction in terms of prosecution.
Were you aware of any discussions within the security team in the context of action against Post Office employees or agents about the deterrent effect of prosecution?
Absolutely, yes.
And what was the substance of those discussions?
So there was a period within the function where the function started to rely quite heavily on academic underpinnings. If you look at the conditions that exist to entailing what's referred to as a motivated offender, one of those things that needs to be in presence is what's called the absence of a capable guardian. And that can be a physical individual, an entity that stops you from doing something. Likewise, it was recognised that a policy that was unwavering in its approach towards prosecution could act as that capable guardian that then hopefully would influence correctly those individuals who may be tempted to commit wrongdoing against the business. And I think it's probably fair to say that that was being recognised during that time as being something that was important to set the scene, set the standard, and as I say, act as that policy-driven capable guardian.
To what extent was this a relevant factor for those making decisions, including you, on whether or not to prosecute?
I don't know if that actual element would have been the relevant factor. And I know I cover it in the statement. From my perspective, offering that sign-off towards prosecution, wrongly or rightly, I think probably for me, and I suspect for other signatories in the period as well, was almost a fait accompli dependent on what the criminal law team were actually advising. I never felt in a position, certainly not professionally, to go into absolute battle with criminal law team around a decision that they'd made in terms of prosecution.
At any point that you had involvement in post office investigations and prosecutions, did you understand that the post office was unusual in that it was the alleged victim of the crimes which it investigated? It investigated such suspected crimes itself, and it decided whether to prosecute such suspected crimes itself.
Absolutely, and I think if I recall, that was covered at various iterations of formal training that would have been given to investigators.
So it was victim, investigator, and prosecutor.
Correct.
At the time, were you conscious of the risks that may arise on account of the post office being simultaneously victim, investigator, and prosecutor?
With honesty, not at the time, but obviously I am now.
When you look at it now, do you see the risk that might attach, in particular, to the post office's disclosure obligations as a prosecutor or its use of expert evidence?
Absolutely.
Were these risks ever discussed within the security team as far as you're aware?
Never.
Were they acknowledged in any post office or Royal Mail policy that you have seen?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Were any particular steps taken, to your knowledge, in recognition of these risks by way of training for investigators, first of all?
In terms of, sorry, can you just expand on that, please?
Were any steps taken, to your knowledge, in recognition of these risks in training for investigators?
Not to my knowledge, no. Other than obviously going through the mechanics of case preparation.
Were any particular steps taken in your training in relation to being a prosecution decision maker?
So, I recall being given guidance during a period when I was acting for one of the security leads. So I wouldn't have been promoted substantively to the level of signing those off. I remember acting for a period, and I also remember discussions around responsibilities with one or other of the principal lawyers within the criminal law team at the time. But certainly there was nothing I could point to that said this was a formal training brief or formal aid memoir about how you actually deal with that type of case. No, there was nothing.
Did you consider at the time you worked within the security team the extent to which prosecution served the post office's broader commercial interests, such as the reduction of debt and the increase of income?
Not so much that, no, but certainly to go back to the earlier point, that whole concept of capable guardian, i.e. something that exists that hopefully drives individuals to keep, as we saw at the time, onto the straight and narrow. I saw that as being more paramount than a focus on actually balancing recovery versus loss in that commercial way.
The inquiry has heard evidence that in late 2005, you put Paul Whittaker and Mick Matthews forward for a new role for the security team, that of financial investigator. Is that right?
Paul Whittaker?
Paul Whittaker and Mick Matthews. It was Mr. Whittaker's evidence that you had put him and Mr. Matthews forward for a new role in the security team, the financial investigator role, in around late 2005.
I don't actually call, I mean, obviously I know the individuals. I don't recall Mr. Whittaker being put forward for that role. I thought at the time there would have been
Apologies.
Jed Harbison.
This is entirely my fault at Jed Harbison.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Mr. Harbison, yes, definitely.
Mr. Harbinson provided evidence that this new role was campaigned for by you. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't. There's absolutely no way in my wildest dreams that I've had that amount of influence within the business to actually design and to populate a role like that. Absolutely not, no. There would have been... I thought those functions existed within group. There would have been perhaps a role that I had in the design of a post office structure that had to map over those roles from group to a self-sufficiency within Post Office Limited, if that makes sense. But I didn't see any of the exec board or the type of levers you'd need to enact to populate those roles and commission or canvas for those roles to exist within the Post Office. Certainly not.
Do you recall the introduction of that new role of financial investigation?
I do.
And was the intention to recoup losses through the Proceeds of Crime Act?
It was.
So before you took up the role of taking prosecution decisions, the business desire to recover losses was something you were aware of and involved as a senior appropriate officer. Is that right?
It was.
Does it remain your position that commercial considerations were not something you were conscious of when taking prosecution decisions?
I never saw those as being paramount.
Do you see here a potential for a conflict of interest arising?
Yes, most definitely.
While we are on the topic of financial investigation and recovery, you say in your statement at paragraph 27, if we can have that on screen, please. That's page 13. You say here about halfway down that John Scott, head of security, had overarching responsibility for the strategy around recovery. Are you, and you say here you recall conversations with him around calculations concerning recoverable amounts and defendants' benefit. You recall a specific challenge raised by the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters around the calculation of the recoverable amount in a particular case. Can you help with what it was that was being challenged?
I seem to recall that the calculation that was being applied had resulted in confiscation of an amount some way in excess of the post office loss.
You refer at paragraph 34 of your statement to 3 Royal Mail Group policies, which would have come across your desk, as you put it, and whilst you do not specifically recall them, you say would have been applicable to your team. One of these is the December 2007 Royal Mail Group Limited Criminal Investigation and Prosecution Policy. Could we have that on screen, please? The reference is POL 000-30578. This is, as you have noted in your statement, a Royal Mail Group policy. The purpose is set out at the top. It describes the Royal Mail Group Limited response to crime and suspected crime against the organisation. If we can look, please, at point 4 on page 4 of this document. Under deployment, it says this policy is published on the Royal Mail intranet site as policy number S2. When you worked within the security team, did you have access to the Royal Mail intranet site?
I don't recall that, sorry.
You don't recall whether you did, or you don't recall having access?
I don't recall whether I had access to the Royal Mail intranet site.
You say you don't specifically recall this document. Do you think you read it at the time it applied to the work of your team?
I would have been surprised if I hadn't.
Taking some of the principles set out in this policy and starting with paragraph 3.1.4, that's back a page, please. And again. And again. Under conduct of investigations, the conduct, course and progress of an investigation will be a matter for the investigators as long as it is within the law, rules and priorities of the business. Investigators will ultimately report to the Director of Security with regard to the conduct of criminal investigations. So this document here was not purporting to give any guidance to investigators about how they should conduct an investigation, was it?
Correct.
Some legislation is identified within this policy. So, for example, under 3.2.2, please, on page 2. You can see there, evidence will be gathered and retained in accordance with the Criminal Procedure and Investigations Act 1996, Codes of Practice. Under 3.2.8 on casework, this is page 3. And under casework, investigations leading to potential prosecution will be reported in accordance with the Criminal Procedure and Investigations Act 1996 and the Code of Practice. There's no explanation in this document, is there, about the requirements that are set down by the Act and the Code, is there?
Absolutely none whatsoever.
There is some suggestion the detail might be contained elsewhere. Going back to the section on deployment, that's page 4, section 4. It says investigation procedures and standards relating to this policy are included in the induction and ongoing training courses and material provided to investigators. Any changes to the procedures and standards are notified to investigators via investigation circulars and communications. And there is also a specific section applicable to the Post Office, paragraph 3.2.12, just above section 4. Which applies to Post Office Limited investigation. While adhering to legislative and group policy requirements, the POL investigation team have additional and in some cases alternative procedures and standards and supporting documentation with which Post Office Limited colleagues will comply. Post Office Limited investigation team will maintain a separate casework procedure and database. Do you recall there being a separate casework procedure and database?
Not specifically, no.
Do you recall there being a database?
No.
In relation to the prosecution policy, page 2 again, please. At 3.1.6, the heading is prosecuting criminals. This policy supports the Code of Business Standards in normally prosecuting those who commit theft or fraud, and where appropriate offences under the Postal Services Act 2000, sections 83 and 84. Stopping there, the heading here and what follows rather assumes that it has already been established that the person suspected of committing a crime is guilty of it, doesn't it?
It does.
They are a criminal, those who commit theft or fraud.
It's clumsy. It does.
Was this the way that those being prosecuted by the Post Office were spoken about by those within the security team?
On occasion, yes.
Do you think, looking back, that this might have reflected a mindset that if there was, on the face of things, a loss, a sub-postmaster or employee was guilty of theft, fraud, or false accounting?
I think there was an element of groupthink in that. Yes, I do.
Moving then to paragraph 3.2.9 on page 3, prosecution. Suspect offenders will be prosecuted where there is sufficient evidence and it is in the public interest in accordance with the Code for Crown Prosecutors. Decisions to prosecute in non-Crown Prosecution Services cases will be taken by nominated representatives in the business with consideration to the advice provided by the Royal Mail Group Criminal Law Team. In relation to responsibility for deciding whether to prosecute an individual or not, we can see the position as set out here is that the decision would be taken by the nominated representatives in the business, consideration to the advice from the criminal law team. This is in 2007. As far as you can recall, does the position set out here in the policy accurately reflect who was in fact making decisions on prosecutions in 2007?
In terms of nominated representative, yes, it would have done.
This document is the first prosecution policy document the inquiry has seen which sets out with any specificity who will take the prosecution decision. Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 55 of Mr. Pardoe's statement? That is page 22 of WITN 081-70100. And under the heading here, decisions about prosecution and criminal enforcement proceedings, you say this at 55. There was a period when I dealt with prosecution decisions, both as a conduit between the Post Office Investigation Department and line managers making the decision, and then as a period myself as the nominated representative. I'm unsure why the switch was made between line manager and security as a nominated representative, but it occurred. When you refer to line managers taking prosecution decisions, who are you referring to?
So there would have been a time, and it would really be going back to the earliest days of my career within the security function, where at a local district level, line managers within the district would make a recommendation on the back of an investigation conducted by the Post Office Investigation Department and an advice offered by the criminal law team about whether prosecution would be signed off. It was dealt with on such a local level. I certainly remember that. That was outside of the security line. That was dealt with dependent on seniority, maybe not line manager, maybe more accurate with hindsight to read line manager, but I certainly recall in my earliest days decisions being made by an out of the security function line manager.
Can you recall when the switch was made?
So we moved from districts, we moved to regions. I suspect that even then a regional representative was signing off the prosecution element. So we'd probably be coming into the start of the 2000s, but probably maybe even coming into the date of that policy document.
Do you recall the reason for the change?
I was never apprised as to the reason, no, never.
At paragraph 57, going over the page, please. You deal here with a document which the inquiry understands to date to around 2012. Unless you wish to go to it, we needn't have that up on screen. But the document reference for the transcript is POL 001-04929. This document suggests that it was the head of security who would make the prosecution decision. Is it right that you don't recall this being the case while you were in a security operations role?
Correct, and indeed from the evidence that I've seen through the inquiry that was not the case. It was at, I think I say that it was at the latter end of my career.
As to the process you would follow when you were in the prosecution decision-making role, you deal with this in general terms at paragraph 56. Going back a page, please. You say this: a decision to prosecute would only ever be made in the face of supporting advice from the criminal law team. CLT would have seen all the facts appertaining to the case, including audit reports, investigator report, supporting evidence, and interview précis. My expectation was that the CLT, as an integral part of post office security, would have made all the due considerations in line with Code for Crown Prosecutors and applied each necessary test in reaching their decision. I took a stance that the decision will have been checked by CLT for fairness and objectivity. I saw my role to confirm their decision and place the case into prosecution status via the investigation team leader. Moving over the page, please, to paragraph 59. You say, in terms of test around the correctness of prosecution and charging decisions, then I firmly expected this to have been considered at the CLT stage. If they had felt that public interest factors tended against prosecution, then my expectation was that this would have been clearly stated. I'm genuinely not attempting to be evasive, but I failed to see what additional input I was providing around correctness when a principal or senior lawyer had carefully made the charging decision. And then at 60, the question around charges was solely within CLT, whilst towards the end of my tenure, I'm aware that investigators would recommend charges when submitting papers into the CLT. The ultimate recommendations sat with CLT. Again, in terms of prosecution decision, then my expectation was that all elements had been considered by CLT in reaching a decision. Do you recall ever declining to provide your authority when the criminal law team's advice was that the prosecution test was met?
Not my authority, although I do reference in the statement, I recall with some clarity when a case came into the district, early days of my career, with a prosecution consensus from criminal law team, and that was returned as being not agreed with, yes.
And what was the reason for not agreeing?
Ironically, it was a case I had some detailed knowledge of. I know that I'd supported POID in the case. It was an individual who took over the running of a post office in, I guess, one of the less salubrious areas of the northwest of England. For whatever reason, the local community had taken almost an immediate dislike to him. He'd been subject to quite serious physical assault on a number of occasions when going about his day-to-day life in the community. His backyard to the post office had actually effectively been booby-trapped, in so much as if you'd have opened the rear gate into his backyard, 2 large concrete blocks would have dropped onto whoever opened the gate. That was spotted, fortunately, by his partner as she was taking a child of probably no more than 1 or 2 years of age in a pram out into the backyard. You could only imagine if that hadn't been spotted what the ramifications could have been. It's fair to say that individual probably lost their head, which is understandable. They moved their infant child and wife away from the premises, incurred additional rental demands on their income as a result of that, went into a complete state of disarray. And I apprised it was the time the head of services for the district of the facts to that, even though they'd been detailed comprehensively within the Post Office Investigation Department report. And between us, it was decided that it served no useful interest to place that sub-postmaster into prosecution for the false accounts that had been completed to cover the fact that monies had been stolen to support his wife and child as they lived away from the premises.
Would you have seen the advice of the criminal law team, where the advice was that the prosecution test was not met?
Yes.
Was there ever a case where you pushed back against the advice that the test for prosecution was not met?
I don't recall when not met. No, I think it's probably fair to say that the vast majority of cases that went forward where there was felt to be a prima facie case to answer probably came back with a prosecution decision from the criminal law team.
Looking back now, do you think you were conscious, truly actively conscious, that as a prosecution decision maker, you had a different and distinct role to that of the investigators in your strand of the security team?
Yes, I was conscious of that. I have no truck with taking responsibility for decisions that I was making during that period. I still thought that I was, in effect, rubber stamping and placing back into an operational casework environment a decision that had been made by a highly qualified, on occasion, principal lawyer within the criminal law team. And sat here now, that may sound a weak approach, but I think if you compare and contrast 5-6 years of legal training plus principal law status within the group and then post office criminal law team, and you compare that to my own experience, I think it's probably understandable why I'd take that viewpoint.
Looking back now, do you think it was appropriate for a non-legally qualified post office employee to be the sign-off for a decision as significant to the lives of individuals and to the business as a prosecution?
So if I just almost replaying that through my mind, so a criminal law team lawyer would make the overview in the first instance. Should that then have sat with somebody else who was suitably legally qualified to effectively rubber stamp that decision? I think probably the element that's missing with respect there is that element of true independence. I couldn't sit here and argue or debate that I was an independent oversight in that whole process. Of course I wasn't. I was heavily employed, heavily invested within the function. So I think what was missing there again with respect, would be an element of true independence to that process.
How did you satisfy yourself that there was a genuine loss to the business in cases where you were being asked to approve the prosecution? Or did that not enter your mind as something that was a question for you?
So the case papers would obviously come across my desk at some stage. I think there was a period when casework may have been performed electronically, but nevertheless, I would see the investigator's report, and that would be a structured report. And part of the demands of that report is that it would outline the most current loss, known loss to the business. I'd read through that report, so I'd be fully aware that we were stating there was a loss to the business at that stage, and that's even before it found its way to the criminal law team. So when the advice came back from the criminal law team with whatever charges were felt to be appropriate, I'd have been aware that certainly the post office was stating that there was a particular loss attached to that case.
Did you ever give consideration to whether a shortfall might have been caused by a user error stemming from inadequate training on the Horizon system?
No. And I think what there was almost a mentality, not just from myself, but probably from an investigator perspective as well, that the admission to false accounting, that was almost it, and that's what should have been reported. So I think there was probably less focus given to the root cause than there was to actually submitting a set of case papers that outlined the fact that there was that admission to false accounting. And the standard way would be you detail the date when the first account was prepared falsely, one in the middle, and then the last account was prepared falsely. So I think that was probably something that was occurring at the time, yes.
So were you simply taking it as a given that there was a loss?
Yes.
You say at paragraph 40 of your statement that you recall there being a template around the construction of case files to standardise casework. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
And you then deal at paragraph 67 to 76 with a number of casework compliance documents. One document which the inquiry sent to you for the purposes of preparing your statement was a document entitled Casework Management. And there are two versions of that, one dated March 2000 and one dated October 2002. Is it right that you do not specifically recall receiving either version of this document before they were provided to you by the inquiry?
Yes, but again, logic would dictate that they, at some stage, I would have been aware of those.
And this document in both versions sets out the need for two separate reports. One, the conduct report, to go to the discipline manager, and another, the legal report, to go to the criminal law team. Sensitive information should only be included in the legal report, not the conduct report. And there are also paragraphs dealing with both operational and procedural failures identified during an investigation. Is that a fair summary of the nature of the document?
Absolutely, yes.
And if we could have paragraph 68, please, on screen. This is page 26. You've addressed your understanding of the document at some length in this paragraph. Without going through line by line and taking it fairly shortly, is it right that you never read this document as being applicable to bugs, errors, or defects in the Horizon system?
Absolutely.
And you provide an example of what the instructions contained within the document might apply to. In short, is it an example of weakness in a product which, if known about by unscrupulous people, might be exploited to commit fraud?
Correct.
You say at paragraph 71 of your statement, and that's page 27 over the page, you say that it was also your understanding that every single document and investigator comment on organisational weaknesses should have been subject to review by the criminal law team and the disclosure test applied accordingly. You say that you recall the criminal law team specifically advising you that this would be the case. Is that right?
It is.
Who was it who advised you of this? Can you recall?
Yeah, Rob Wilson.
The inquiry has provided you with a number of emails from 2011 and 2012 from David Posnett relating to casework compliance. Is it right that you recall something of the introduction of compliance checks in 2011?
It is. I recall the concept. Yes, I do.
Can we have the first of the emails from David Posnett on the screen, please? This is document reference POL 00118096. Looking, please, at the email starting about halfway down the page. From David Posnett to a number of security team recipients, including you. It's dated the 23rd of May 2011, and the subject is casework compliance. The email reads as follows. Most of you are aware that case files submitted for legal advice will become subject to compliance checks. This process is due to commence in June and is designed to raise standards of files submitted, including their contents, reports, tape summaries, appendix enclosures, recoveries, stakeholders, etc., and ensure there is a consistent approach across the team. It is also probably an opportune time, given that we have recently recruited new people to the team. I've associated relevant documents that feed into the compliance process. Please familiarise yourself with these documents. A number of compliance documents were attached to Mr. Posnett's email in a zip file. Presumably, given the instruction in Mr. Posnett's email to familiarise yourself with the documents attached, would you have read them all when you received this email?
I think it's probably fair to say, at best, they'd have been scan read. I wouldn't have expected to go into them in the same level of detail. And I recognise, obviously, all the names there in the two box. I wouldn't expect to go into the same level of detail as, say, an existing team leader. But yes, I would have given it the due attention of opening those and just scanning them.
One of the documents which Mr. Posnett asked recipients of his email to familiarise themselves with was the identification codes document. This is a document which you comment on at paragraph 75 of your statement. The inquiry is familiar with this document, and I do not intend to display it on screen. But do you know the document I'm referring to?
It's absolutely abhorrent, I do indeed, yes.
Does it remain your position that you do not recall reviewing the document at the time?
I think it remains my position. Had I been consciously aware of that document at the time, I would have vehemently challenged that document. It was completely unacceptable.
You say at paragraph 76 of your statement, and could we have that on screen, please? That is page 29 of Mr. Pardoe's statement. You say here, we did instruct investigators to record identification codes. My recollection was that these were required to complete any submission into police, to have details of subsequent convictions entered onto the PNC. These were referred to as NIB-type details. I certainly don't recall the horrendous language on the form or the obsolete country names. Do you recall there being a specific form used by the Post Office as a non-police agency to notify the police of criminal proceedings?
I think I probably recall a number of variations of that form. I would have referred, I think nib-type details would have been appertaining to when I was an operational investigator. I think that they changed then to MPA details.
Could we have on screen, please, document reference POL 00118374? This is a blank copy of the form NPA01. Do you recognise that now?
I do indeed.
We can see the agency name Post Office Limited at the top left. Then there are boxes for various identifying details of the person being charged or summoned. The prosecuting agents are identified about halfway down the page as the Post Office Legal Services Criminal Law Team. And then over the page, please. There are a number of options there for ethnic appearance, and there are 7 boxes for those options. Is this the form that you understood investigators to use to notify the police of proceedings?
At that time, yes. It certainly, from memory, it would have been different than the form I would have been completing as an operational investigator, but certainly at the time that I was in the Strand, that's the form I recognise investigators would complete.
Was this the form on which they would identify the identification code which applied in any given case for the police?
I'm failing to see that actual field where that's actually inserted.
Well, the ethnic appearance boxes, there are 7 options there. White European, dark European, Afro-Caribbean, Asian, Oriental, Arab and unknown.
Correct.
Do they accord with the options as you understood them for submission to the police or not?
Correct. They do.
So is it right then that no reference to the identification codes documents circulated by Mr. Posnett in 2011 was necessary to provide identity code information to the police?
Absolutely correct, yes.
Turning back then to Mr. Posnett's zip file of compliance documents, could we have document reference POL 00118101? This is one of the attachments. This is the guide to the preparation and layout of investigation, red label case files, offender reports and discipline reports. I think you had the opportunity of reading this for the purposes of preparing your statement.
I did.
So starting on page 4 of that document, please, we see a preamble for the policy template of an offender report. Scrolling down a little, please. And going over to the top of the next page, please. At the top right, we see identification code, brackets, numbers 1 to 7 only. And the identification codes document which Mr. Posnett had circulated had 7 options, didn't it, in terms of identification codes?
It did.
So investigators were being instructed to enter an identification code limited to options 1 to 7.
Correct.
They were being provided with the identification codes document sent in the same compliance zip file which you describe as utterly abhorrent.
Correct.
Was there any other way for investigators receiving Mr. Posnett's suite of compliance documents to interpret the instruction other than use this identification codes document to complete the identification code space on the offender report?
I think the only exception to that would be the more long-serving investigators who may hold an alternative version of the identity codes document without reference to such offensive terms.
Given that it was not necessary to use this document, the identification codes document circulated by Mr. Posnett, for police notification purposes, because the options were there on the face of the form, can you help us with why it was being used to populate the offender report?
Absolutely no idea, sorry, no.
Turning please to the involvement of Post Office investigators following the identification of an apparent shortfall at audit. In relation to cases where an apparent shortfall was discovered at audit, you recall there being a triggers and timescale document that covered the monetary loss value at which investigators would get involved. Is that right?
It is.
Is it right that you recall, at least at some stage, a £1,000 loss being the minimum level for the involvement of investigators?
Yes.
Do you recall what the rationale was for there being a minimum level of apparent loss for the commencement of a criminal investigation?
Sheer volume of work.
What were the other triggers for a criminal investigation in addition to the level of an apparent shortfall?
I think it would have been victim impact, so I would expect that an investigation would have been triggered if, say, the alleged fraud was directly impacting a customer of Post Office. I can't really think of any others outside of that.
You say at paragraph 6 of your statement that in the face of reductions in investigator numbers, lower level cases would not have been progressed. We've heard evidence from Tony Utting that there came a time when restructuring of the security team and a reduction in headcount led to a rising of the triggers for a criminal investigation. Do you recall that?
I don't recall the explicit instruction, but I wouldn't challenge that. I certainly, as an operational investigator, dealt with lines of operational investigation that simply would not have been taken on, for want of a better expression, after, say, 2000, 2005.
Where the level of an apparent shortfall identified on audit wasn't sufficient to trigger a criminal investigation, what steps were taken by the Post Office in relation to the apparent shortfall?
So my understanding and expectation is that would have been dealt with by the local line management in various monikers, whether that's the area sales manager or area support manager. I think that title changed over the years, although the functionality remained broadly similar. It would have been dealt with at a local level, but still with a focus on repayment back to the business.
So were attempts made to recover the apparent shortfall under a sub-postmaster's contract?
The contract, that clause in the contract, the sub-postmaster is responsible for all losses no matter how they occur, would have been pursued relentlessly.
Absent the criminal investigation machinery, did the Post Office consider itself under any obligation to get to the bottom of the cause of an apparent shortfall, or was it sufficient for debt recovery purposes that there was one?
In terms of a case that the investigation function was taken forward, or where it sat with
Where it wasn't being taken
when it wasn't being taken forward. I think that would probably depend on the tenacity of the area manager. I don't think that there's any form of policy document or expectation that that would be the case.
You refer at paragraph 49 of your statement to the steps which were taken once a reportable audit discrepancy had been identified. By reportable audit discrepancy, do you mean one which triggered the involvement of investigators?
I do.
Who decided whether an audit discrepancy was reportable?
So I think if it was in excess of the prevailing triggers document at that time, then the mechanics would be that the audit function would report that into an investigation contact point.
You discuss the purpose of an investigator attending a branch at paragraph 45 of your statement, and you say it was to secure and examine evidence and take an account from the person responsible. You then set out at paragraph 49 to 54 some more detail in terms of the process, which you say investigators would follow, following identification of a shortfall at audit. Were you ever an investigator in a case where a reportable discrepancy was discovered on audit of a branch after the introduction of the Horizon system?
As an operational investigator?
Yes.
No, never.
Is the detail at paragraphs 49 to 54 based on your practice when you were an investigator?
Broadly, yes. I think probably the only add-ons for that would be source documentation post-Horizon that the investigator would obtain from the auditor at branch. But the mechanics of, you know, the use of a pocket book, the mechanics of invite to tape recorded interview with all that entailed under PACE would be the same, yes.
When you were leading the fraud strand and security operations function, what documents would you have expected investigators operating under your leadership to secure when they attended a branch in an apparent shortfall case?
The relevant documentation that would evidence the shortfall at branch obtained from the auditor to enable production at the first account type of interview under caution.
Are you referring there to the Horizon reports which could be printed from the counter in the branch?
Yes, plus any supplementary evidence that the auditor had brought to the branch because a risk audit may have been triggered by other elements such as a reluctance to return ostensibly excess cash held by the branch. So obviously if those type of details were held by the auditor, my expectation is that they would have been taken into the interview as well and an account asked for that form of scenario.
You say at paragraph 45 of your statement that an investigator would have engaged with the retail line in terms of the future of the office immediately post-audit. Would the views of a retail line manager ever have had any bearing on whether a criminal investigation was commenced in the first place?
No, never.
In terms of investigatory steps taken after interview of a suspect, where the only evidence of a loss was the Horizon record available in branch or later on credence, when compared with the auditor's findings, what further inquiries would you have expected an investigator to make as part of their investigation before sending their report to casework?
And again, I think that would have been based on the account that had been given at the interview under caution. If there'd been quite a full and frank account, it's fair to say there would be less back research to support the submission to the criminal law team. if the account had been vague, particularly in terms of when shortfall existed and first commenced and so on, I'd have expected them to be more tenacious in obtaining ARQ logs and the like.
When you were an investigator in an apparent shortfall case, did you understand it to be any part of your role to make inquiries into the reliability of the core evidence which was being relied upon to prove the loss to the business?
When I was an investigator.
When you were an investigator.
So when I was an investigator, I'd have been faced with a number of scenarios. Number one would have been the production of daily and weekly handwritten ledgers, which were the daily and weekly books. The other scenario is that at that stage, there was the advent of those books being transcribed electronically, so there were a number of IT systems that did the job of those two handwritten ledgers. I was aware that I was to examine those ledgers and confirm the veracity of the audit findings, yes.
When you led the fraud strand or the security operations function, did you expect your investigators to make inquiries as to the reliability of the core evidence which was being relied upon to prove loss to the business in an apparent shortfall case?
In terms of reliability, then my belief is that the investigator would have accepted the audit findings.
When you were an investigator in an apparent shortfall case, where the suspicion was that someone had stolen money, would you investigate where the money had gone, try and follow the money, so to speak, by making financial inquiries relating to the suspect?
On occasion, yes.
When you led the fraud strand or security operations function, did you expect your investigators to make financial inquiries to try to establish where the money had gone?
If they felt that appropriate, yes.
Was there a checklist of steps to take or any other guidance to ensure all relevant information was identified, collected, and sent to the criminal law team in proceedings brought by the Post Office against sub-postmasters and relevant staff?
I seem to recall there was something that the investigator would be able to rely on, certainly in that case file construction and the contents of the various appendices within that case file construction.
When did you first become aware of a case where a Post Office employee, a sub-postmaster, or a member of a sub-postmaster's staff attributed an apparent shortfall to problems with the Horizon system?
I think it would have been the early part of the 2000s. I can't give any greater clarity than that, unfortunately.
You address your understanding of the purpose of and process for acquiring ARQ data, starting at paragraph 77 of your statement. Could we have that on screen, please? It is page 29 of Mr. Pardoe's statement. You say at 77, I personally was not an operational investigator from the inception of Horizon. I don't recall supporting or certainly leading a Horizon-type investigation. I did obviously lead the fraud strand and security operations function during the pertinent periods, so we'll respond with that in mind. And you go on at paragraph 78 to say this. I appreciate that this is a view that will have been expressed previously, but throughout my tenure, the opinion firmly expressed at every turn, internally, was that Horizon was fit for purpose. I recall with an element of clarity updates from John Scott assuring the security function that the system was reliable, and we were to continue with BAU activity. I appreciate that there became a more measured approach towards the end of my tenure, but I certainly don't recall being involved in those conversations. I also seem to recall an internal Paula Venel's communication in response to the increasing noise around Horizon. Obviously, I can't recall word for word, but the thrust was that the Post Office were defending the system and refuted the claims. My point is that with honesty, the use of tools such as credence data and ARQ logs were, to my mind, used as much to evidence guilt than innocence, and particularly utilised when false accounting was admitted but not theft. My understanding is that the investigator would analyse logs to attempt to evidence theft and wrongdoing, particularly in terms of cash balance declarations and redeclarations. I'm not even sure how the log would denote a bug, error or defect. It's certainly not an area we had any training in, i.e. to spot a bug, error or defect. These are the patterns, data patterns you should search for. You then say the language at POL 0005590 in terms of horizon bashing expressed by a senior lawyer was not uncommon. Pausing there, could we have the document referred to here on screen, please? The reference is POL 0005590. This is an email from John L. Singh to a number of individuals on the 21st of October 2010, following the conclusion of the Seema Misra trial. You are not, in fact, by the looks of things, on the email circulation list here. The email reads as follows. Dear all, after a lengthy trial at Guildford Crown Court, the above-named was found guilty of theft. This case turned from a relatively straightforward general deficiency case to an unprecedented attack on the Horizon system. We were beset with unparalleled degree of disclosure requests by the defence. Through hard work of everyone, Counsel Warwick Tatford, Investigation Officer John Longman, and through the considerable expertise of Gareth Jenkins of Fujitsu, we were able to destroy the criminal standard of proof beyond all reasonable doubt, every single suggestion made by the defence. It is to be hoped the case will set a marker to dissuade other defendants from jumping on the Horizon bashing bandwagon. Is it the language used in the last line of this email that you say in your statement was not uncommon?
Absolutely.
Not uncommon for this particular lawyer, or not uncommon in general?
I believe that was a theme.
At what level within the business was this language being used?
That type of sentiment at every level.
Could we have page 30 of Mr. Pardoe's statement up on screen, please? Paragraph 79 of your statement reads as follows. My understanding is that Fujitsu was contracted to provide audit record query data on demand using an agreed secure process. I seem to recall that the data provided a full log at keystroke levels for the period specified by the investigator and providing transactional and branch reporting detail. I'm aware that this data could be used to identify singleton transactions, like the use of a certain credit card, or a full and complete series of transactions using a date range specified by the requester. Going then, please, to paragraph 91 of the statement. This is page 33. Here you say this, in line with my response at 78, my belief is that there was a cynicism in terms of the steps that were taken to support any assertion that Horizon was the root cause of discrepancies. Horizon data, from my perspective, was primarily a tool to either evidence how false accounting took place or to support a charge of theft, and particularly when theft was denied at interview. I'm struggling to understand how the ARQs would identify a bug, error or defect, and particularly if their presence was subtle and sat beneath obvious keystroke data. And at 92, I'm not aware of circumstances where an ARQ was provided to a SPMR, save for prosecution cases, when I would have expected the data to be disclosed. Should the Chair understand from the paragraphs of your statement that we've just looked at that ARQ data was primarily obtained in order to support a prosecution once the decision had been made to prosecute?
I think there may have been a variety of approaches to that.
So the purpose of obtaining ARQ data was not, at least in your mind, for an investigator to test the reliability of the core evidence being relied upon to prove an offence,
That's correct.
or to pursue a line of inquiry which might lead away from the guilt of a suspect.
That's correct.
Do you recall ARQ data ever being obtained before a decision had been made to prosecute? You just referred to a variety of approaches.
I think on occasion it would be, yes.
You recall there being limits in respect of ARQ requests, and you address that at paragraph 80 of your statement. Could we have that on screen, please? It's page 30. You say here that a document has refreshed your memory, and you can recall that as a function, we were capped within contract at 720 requests per annum. Was that per annum, PA?
It is, yes.
I seem to recall that this changed during mediation, but I wasn't involved in discussions around this and am not aware what the uplift was. I seem to recall that additional requests were around £500. I don't specifically remember being involved in uplift conversations that authorised these. It certainly wasn't a budget that I held, and I presume that John Scott would have addressed this with the wider business. And then at paragraph 81, I don't recall specifically any changes between Legacy Horizon and Horizon Online. I do not recall investigator noise that this was proving to be problematic. By investigator noise, do you mean you were not aware of investigators complaining about the limits on ARQ requests?
I think an element of that, and also any difficulties in investigation because the business had changed from Legacy Horizon with local storage and transmission to rather towards Horizon Online. I don't recall any noise for either of those instances.
Do you recognise, however, that the existence of limits was likely to impact upon the number of cases in which ARQ requests were made?
I do indeed, and I think probably earlier to this, there was a greater demand on the limits because the demise of the benefit book as a method of payment, a decision was made by the, at the time, DWP to cease reconciliation of postmaster submissions. And so the business took a risk-based view that they would sit that reconciliation within house. So that in itself, because of the findings of the reconciliation function, if I recall, also led to a greater demand on ARQ requests.
Sir, I have reached the end of one topic, and the next topic is a little larger. Would now be a convenient time to have an early lunch? Sir, I think you're on mute.
How are we doing generally in terms of closing at 2 o'clock? Because that is, I'm afraid, an unmovable cut-off point.
So we're making good progress. If we take 30 minutes for lunch, we should be fine to finish at 2 o'clock, including, I hope, core participant questions.
Well, it will have to include them, so to speak. So between you and them, you'll have to arrange the rest of the programme to permit that to happen, if I can put that in that way. All right?
Yes, sir. Understood.
Fine. Okay, so what do we make the time now? 11:54 I make the time. So 12:25?
Yes, please, sir.
Fine.